Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome everybody to the final plenary session of the 2024 Aleksanteri Conference. My name is Anatoly Pinsky, and I'm a historian and a visiting researcher at the Aleksanteri Institute. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome everybody to Ben Nathan's talk today about his book, which is entitled "To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement." So Ben is an endowed associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches imperial, Russian, Soviet, and modern Jewish history, as well as the history of human rights. So Ben is a pillar of all of these fields, and his scholarly biography is beyond impressive. To mention just a couple of titles, Ben is the author of the classic Beyond the Pale, The Jewish Encounter with Late Imperial Russia, which appeared in 2002, and the editor or co-editor of several books, including most recently From Europe's East to the Middle East, Israel's Russian and Polish lineages, which appeared in 2021. And he is also a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. The book Ben will be talking about today was published just a few months ago, and I think it's fair to say it became a classic immediately. Like so many of my colleagues, I've waited for many years to read the book, and I'm very grateful, as I think many of us are, for its appearance. So I was first introduced to Ben's work on dissidents when I was a graduate student in 2007 in New York City, and this was by way of an article that he had written and published that same year on a dissident whom I'm sure he'll be talking a little bit about today, Alexander Volpin. The article was outstanding and really a model of how to combine analytical and narrative history. I've assigned that article in almost every course that I've taught in Soviet history, and I'm sure I'll be able to say the same soon about Ben's book. So today, Ben will be talking for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. We have an hour total. But now, let me turn the floor over to Ben, and please help me welcome him today. Thank you.
Thank you, Anatoly, not only for the introduction, but also for inviting me here to Helsinki to take part in the conference and to speak to all of you today. Thank you all for coming. I know this was a little bit apart from the main setting of the conference, but this is a fantastic setting for us to all, as it says on the title, think together in the Think Corner. I am going to speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have the remaining part of the hour to get questions from the audience and develop what I hope will be a fruitful conversation about my topic. Many of you have probably encountered the idea that the Soviet Union collapsed in an extraordinarily sudden manner that almost nobody foresaw, including the various Western intelligence services, and that Mikhail Gorbachev and the team of reformers around him deserve either the credit or the blame, depending on your politics, for the final end of the Soviet Union and the end of the era of totalitarianism in Russia, an era that lasted longer than any other single example of that form of governance. The premise of my book is that the exit from a totalitarian system was not sudden, that it was rather gradual, and that it began long before Gorbachev joined the Communist Party and rose to the pinnacle of the power system within that party. That it began in the 1950s, and that the leading edge of the slow and even today incomplete exit from totalitarian rule was played by Soviet dissidents. Those of you who are above a certain age will remember some of the names of those dissidents who became world famous in their time. You will remember people like Andrei Sakharov, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, perhaps Natan Sharansky, the first two of them winners of the Nobel Prize, people who literally became household names in the United States, in Finland, all over Europe, and in other parts of the world. What I discovered in the process of doing research for this book is that neither Sakharov nor Solzhenitsyn, as accomplished and famous as they were the engines of the dissident movement. Solzhenitsyn was not a movement person by character. He was an individualist. He never signed group petitions. He never saw himself as part of this movement. Sakharov did, but arrived relatively late. And so I started to ask myself, who were the people who built this movement? Who were the people who, one by one, became dissidents, found their way to each other, and found their way eventually to the language of human rights? What does that trajectory look like? The title of my book, To the Success of Our Hopeless Cause, is one of the most famous dissident toasts, a toast that was made countless times around kitchen tables in Moscow and Leningrad and Kyiv and many other Soviet cities. For me, it captures a very deep, long-running antinomy, set of oppositions within Russian and Soviet culture between boldness and despair. Because the dissidents recognized the hopelessness of their undertaking, and yet they persisted in their activism. And it's that combination of boldness and despair that I think comes through not only in that toast, but again and again in the memoirs and other statements of identity and ambition that this movement produced. The subtitle, though, is really the key to the book, The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement. And by that I mean the many lives that we haven't heard of, people who did not become famous around the world, the people who did not win the Nobel Prize. Western media had a very large impact on who became famous in this movement, who had the spotlight shining on them, and who remained in the shadows. And my book is primarily about the people in the shadows. The first thing that I noticed about the people in the shadows, the people who actually built the movement, is that very many of them were women. And women were never considered either real or potential leadership figures in this field, in part because the Western journalists who were covering the movement in real time from Moscow out were without exception men. And they simply didn't take the women members of this movement seriously as leadership figures. But the other factor is that the movement itself had an extremely uncomfortable relationship with the idea of leadership per se, with the idea of hierarchy, division of labor, leaders and followers. So the movement resisted the kind of pattern that the Western gaze wanted to impose on it, of leading Russian figures, men, intellectuals, with a small, medium, or large, no one really ever knew, small, medium, or large following behind them. That is simply not the structure that the movement itself gravitated towards. But there's also a bit of a wordplay in the subtitle. The Many Lives of the Soviet Dissident Movement refers to the fact that the movement had several near-death experiences. And to emerge from those near-death experiences, it had to reinvent itself, or as I like to say, it had to reformat itself into a new genre of social movement. And I'll be taking you through some of those near-death experiences and the reincarnations that followed. So the story begins, as Anatoly alluded to, with a figure who I think has been completely overlooked in the treatment of this movement by the media and by subsequent historians, and that is the eccentric Moscow mathematician Alexander Volpin. He wasn't just a mathematician, he was a mathematical logician, which means he was interested in the nature of truth statements. What is it that constitutes a truth statement in mathematics? What is the nature of proof or disproof? The kind of mathematics that I gave up trying to understand within weeks of beginning to familiarize myself with his work, because it's so complicated. But Volpin had a quality that I greatly admire in Russian and other Soviet-era intellectuals, which was his contempt for disciplinary boundaries. So while it's true that he was a mathematician by training with a PhD in the subject from the premier university in the Soviet Union, Moscow State University, Volpin was someone who fearlessly investigated and deployed other disciplines. He, like many intellectuals of the mid-century era, the 1950s, 1960s, was interested in the then new field of cybernetics. Cybernetics having been kind of invented by the MIT professor Norbert Wiener. And this was an approach to knowledge per se that attempted to translate all forms of knowledge into what we would now call algorithms or programs, some form of quantification. It was a discipline that had the ambition of replacing dialectical materialism in the Soviet Union, the master discipline. And Volpin was part of a movement of people across the Western and Eastern world who were interested in creating what they called an ideal language. A language that was free of the ambiguities of human language, or what we call natural languages, where words can have multiple meanings, syntactical and grammatical relations between words are often ambiguous, and all of the resulting confusion that enables. Ideal language philosophy, as it was called, took as its holy grail the creation of a language that would be perfectly transparent. Or as Volpin put it, a language where we would finally be able to trust our own thoughts. He never found it, he never invented it, and neither did anybody else, although there are certain people in Silicon Valley who are still in hot pursuit. But because of his own biography, and because Volpin was subject to several arrests in the late Stalinist period, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, because he was sent against his will to a psychiatric institution in lieu of standing trial after one of those arrests, and because he was exiled to Central Asia in the waning years of the Stalin era, just before Stalin's death in 1953, his life experience inspired him to look elsewhere for a rough approximation of an ideal language, a language that would spell out with maximum clarity what you're allowed to do, what you're not allowed to do, and what you must do. That was the language of the law, and specifically of Soviet law, because that, after all, is what legal systems are all about. They spell out permissions, prohibitions, and commands. And so Volpin, who had no formal training in jurisprudence or legal studies whatsoever, started investigating Soviet legal documents, and in particular the Soviet Constitution. This was a constitution that dated to 1936, and you can find copies of it online today. Contrary to what may be your expectations, the Soviet Constitution of 1936, at the height not just of the Stalin era, but on the eve of the maximum application of state-sponsored terror by the Stalinist regime, that constitution contains very impressive civil liberties. Statements, guarantees of civil liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. Now, it's true that all of those civil liberties are articulated within the framework of building and maintaining a socialist society, but nonetheless, they are there at the highest level of the legal system in the founding document, the Constitution itself. And Volpin had an epiphany in the 1950s that while that might not be a perfect language, a perfectly transparent language, Soviet law nonetheless held out the possibility of being used as leverage to contain the behavior of the Soviet state, to place constraints on the Soviet state. So I'm telling you about Volpin because he is, or I believe he is, the intellectual godfather of the dissident movement. Because this deceptively simple strategy of trying to force the Soviet state to obey its own laws, that became the grand strategy of the dissident movement. So Volpin starts developing this way of thinking in the late 1950s. And he writes in one of his diary entries, I worked with his diaries at the archive of the Memorial Society in Moscow, a society which has since been liquidated during the build-up to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but whose archive is one of the most valuable repositories, not just for the history of the dissident movement, but for several other topics. And in his diary entry for New Year's Eve, 1961, Volpin announces this idea of using Soviet law to contain the behavior of the Soviet state and says, I'm just waiting for the right opportunity to make this happen. That opportunity arose 4 years later, in the fall of 1965. This is a little bit less than 1 year after Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, has been forcibly removed from office because of his erratic and, in some ways, embarrassing behavior as the premier of the Soviet Union, the Cuban Missile Crisis being the most humiliating incident of all. So he's pulled from power, not killed, but simply forced into retirement. This is in October of 1964, and everybody in the Soviet Union is holding their breath. What comes next? Will Khrushchev's successors continue his policy of liberalization, or as it was called at the time, thawing the Soviet Union out of its Stalinist deep freeze? Or, more likely, since Russians are by nature pessimistic, more likely a return to the Stalinist order? That was the great fear. And one of the first signals that the pessimists may be right was the arrest of two writers. And those of you who know Soviet history will know who I'm referring to. This is Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel, arrested in the fall of 1965. It turns out they had been publishing works abroad under pseudonyms, works that were full of satire and all kinds of veiled or not so veiled criticisms of Soviet politics and Soviet culture. And they were finally unmasked. And Volpin realized this was the moment. He didn't know personally either of these two writers. He had never read a word that they'd published under their pseudonyms. And interestingly, he refused to read a word that they had published because he considered it legally irrelevant to the issue at hand. And the issue at hand was, would this be a Stalinist show trial, or would the trial of these two writers conform to the Code of Criminal Procedure, one of whose rules was trials must be public. They must be open to scrutiny by members of the Soviet public. And so Volpin organized, on the anniversary of the ratification of the Constitution, December 5th, 1965, he organized a gathering that he called the Glasnost meeting. You may remember the word glasnost from the Gorbachev era. It means transparency or openness or publicity. And the agenda of this demonstration would be extremely focused. It would not demand the release of the two writers. It would not insist on their innocence. It would have one minimalist claim, and that is the trial must be open and the Constitution of the Soviet Union must be observed. And this minimalism, this anti-utopianism, anti-maximalism also became part of the DNA of the dissident movement. Simply get the government to observe its own laws. So the meeting lasted about 15 minutes. As you might expect, the KGB had advanced knowledge that it was going to take place. It was held in one of the most resonant spaces in Moscow, in Pushkin Square, near the base of the monument to Russia's national poet, national icon. To this day, it's almost impossible to say how many people participated, because we know there was a core of anywhere from 15 to 50 people who knew about the demonstration from the leaflets that Volpin had distributed ahead of time via samizdat, via hand-typed copying system. But there were lots of friends who came who didn't really want to be participants in the meeting, but they also didn't want to leave their friends isolated and simply came as bystanders to observe. And then there was an unknown number of undercover KGB agents or members of citizen police brigades, the so-called druzhniki, who were also there to shut things down as quickly as possible. And to add to the confusion, Pushkin Square is very near one of the main metro stations in Moscow, and so there are lots of completely unaware passersby who saw something unusual going on and maybe stopped to look. So we really don't know how many people took part. But it doesn't really matter. The point was that the first statement of this principle of using the Soviet legal system as leverage against the state had been put into practice. One way of thinking of this strategy is as a domestic counterpart with no conscious connection, but by analogy, a domestic counterpart to the American Cold War strategy of containment. That was a policy that sought to encircle the Soviet Union with greater or lesser use of military force from the outside. Volpin's form of containment was designed to constrain the Soviet state from within, using its own legal system as the tool. Okay, so this demonstration is held. Lots of people are hauled in for questioning afterwards. There's some minor punishment. Some graduate students are expelled from the university. Volpin himself is interrogated, but no one's arrested. And it was difficult to arrest people for holding up signs saying, "Honor the Soviet Constitution." That seemed like a fairly benign, legal, patriotic thing to say. By the time the trial comes around the following February, now we're in 1966, there are various forms of written protest that are starting to circulate. And after the trial itself, it's discovered that the wives of the two defendants who were permitted, they were almost the only people outside of the selected audience who were invited to actually witness the trial, they had created their own transcript of the proceedings. One of them, who became a prominent dissident herself, Larisa Bogoraz, was a linguist by training and had very good shorthand note-taking skills. And she created an extremely accurate transcript of the trial. How do I know it's accurate? Well, it turns out that the Soviet government also created a transcript of the trial, and that transcript ended up in the dossier of Andrei Sinyavsky, one of the two writers who was tried in February of 1966, and I was able to gain access to that dossier. So the transcript of the trial started to circulate in typescript version via samizdat as well. It was smuggled abroad, translated into most of the major European languages, and became a kind of international sensation. The compilers and the distributors of that document were then arrested for having distributed so-called anti-Soviet propaganda. Protests were held to counter their arrest. Those protesters were arrested, and what you have in a matter of months is something resembling a chain reaction. This was a classic Cold War metaphor. This is the era of nuclear weapons. And chain reaction, I think, is actually an excellent description of the early phase of this movement. It lasts from roughly 1965 to 1968. And by chain reaction, I mean the spontaneous, almost avalanche-like multiplication of protests, smuggled trial transcripts, new arrests, each one producing the next generation of protest in a way that's completely unplanned. The chain reaction period lasts about 3 years and reaches its apex, its high point, in August of 1968, when 8 people come out to protest the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, the crushing of the Prague Spring. These 8 people, 5 men and 3 women, were in a couple of cases known to each other in advance, but in the majority, they were total strangers. One of the ethical injunctions of the dissident movement was not to place pressure on people to protest, if only because the cost of protesting was potentially so catastrophic. It could mean the end of your career. It could mean that your kids would never get into a university. It could also mean arrest and exile. Inside the dissident movement, there was, I would say, a single major fault line. On the one side of the divide were people who liked the dynamic of the chain reaction, who liked the idea of protest that was driven by nothing other than conscience or moral intuition. So no hierarchy, no followers and leaders, nobody telling anybody what to do. As people who were born and raised in the Soviet system, they were sick of being mobilized by their own state, and they certainly weren't about to start mobilizing each other. So this was a voluntarist, you might even say an anarchist movement in this phase. On the other side of that divide were the people who said, you cannot be politically relevant, you can't really have an impact unless you have leaders, unless you have a decision-making process, some degree of coordination, division of labor, responsibilities, duties, etc. That argument went back and forth for years, and I wouldn't say that one side won the argument. It's that the voluntarists were those 8 people, or I should say those 8 people were the leading voluntarists, and they went out on Red Square, and they all got arrested and sentenced to various lengths of prison and exile. So it's not that they lost the argument, it's that they were removed from the argument, and what remained were the organizationalists. It was a near-death experience for the movement, even though those 8 people who demonstrated on Red Square, and by the way, you'll often read that there were 7. It's not true, there were 8. Tanya Bayeva was number 8, but she managed to convince the police that she was just a bystander walking across Red Square. They became iconic figures. Joan Baez wrote a song about some of them. The 15 minutes of that protest on Red Square is probably the most famous 15 minutes of the dissident movement. However, when I went back and read the contemporary reactions to it in samizdat and in letters that people were writing, I discovered that most of the dissident movement was furious about that demonstration because they thought that it embodied the impracticality of the voluntarists. Hadn't been coordinated, only 8 people. What kind of message does that send, that you could only muster 8 people? So it's a near-death experience for the movement. Some of its most prominent figures are shipped off and never really play a role in the movement again. But the movement manages to reinvent itself after 1968, and it does so in a way that I found totally unexpected. It's not just that the people who favor organization and hierarchy start to found organizations. They do. There are a number of them, committees, groups, so-called initiative groups. What I think is most telling is the model that they had for many of the groups that were founded in an attempt to systematize the dissident movement. The model they had was the Western Human Rights NGO, which they had been observing from afar, or in some cases learning about directly through emissaries who came to the Soviet Union. And the most important model for them of a human rights NGO was Amnesty International. I won't go into all the details, but by 1973, in this second phase in the history of the movement, the second life of the movement, if you will, a chapter of Amnesty International is founded in Moscow. This is an extraordinary event, not just for the Soviet dissident movement, but for the history of Amnesty as an organization. Because while Amnesty had broadcast itself to the world as a global organization, speaking the language of global human rights, and while Amnesty bent over backwards to try to make sure that it had political prisoners in its roster of people it was trying to help from the first, second, and third worlds, the worlds of capitalism, socialism, and the global south, as we would now call it. All that's true. The organization itself, however, if you looked at its membership, looked strikingly like the map of NATO. It was a Western organization. Its strongest local representatives were in the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, of course, where it was founded, and other West European countries. So never before in its existence had Amnesty had anything remotely like a branch of the organization behind the Iron Curtain. And for the first time, Soviet dissidents were not looked at solely as prisoners of conscience who would be adopted, and that was the word that Amnesty used, adopted by Amnesty as part of their attempt to get them out of prison or out of exile. Soviet dissidents were now partners in this endeavor. That was both a very powerful and a very troubling development to Amnesty, because Soviet dissidents were operating in a completely different environment. In fact, they were operating in an environment in which the word NGO, non-governmental organization, really didn't make any sense, because the Communist Party exercised a de facto monopoly on public life. So it was a nonsense word to have an NGO in the Soviet setting, but this was an attempt to make reality out of nonsense. The NGO-like phase of the movement also eventually comes to an end, and after the signing of the Helsinki Treaty in this very city in 1975, the final phase of the movement comes into focus. And now, having essentially failed to get the Soviet Union's government to notice this campaign of containing it to its own laws, having sent hundreds of letters, open letters and appeals to the Soviet government, and never once receiving an answer, or rather having received a non-verbal answer in the form of arresting people or searching their apartments or drawing them in for long interrogations with the KGB, the movement shifted to its final strategy. It remained a fundamentally legal strategy, but now the body of law in question was different. It was no longer just Soviet law, it was international law and international human rights norms. Now the logic shifted to highlighting the Soviet government's failure to observe those international accords that it had signed, and most recently was the Helsinki Accord of 1975, and putting pressure on Western co-signatories of those agreements to insist that the Soviet Union abide by those human rights norms. As you know, the Helsinki Accord included a group of human rights articles, none of which was really new. They simply reiterated what the Soviet Union had already committed itself to, and the other signatory countries as well. But for the first time, those remaining figures of the dissident movement who hadn't been imprisoned or exiled were able to document over and over again violations of those norms by the Soviet state. This produced a greater reaction than any of the other protests that the movement had engaged in. The receptivity of Western audiences within the Cold War context was infinitely more satisfying, more powerful, and more efficacious than that of Soviet society. And the dissidents were forced to confront a very uncomfortable fact, which was the fact of their own isolation vis-a-vis Soviet society, and that they had become a group that was appealing to not just foreign powers, but, again, within the context of the Cold War, enemy powers as its form of leverage. The KGB, of course, took note of this, and like many authoritarian or totalitarian systems, the Soviet state regarded its foreign policy as an inviolable royal prerogative. No entity other than the Politburo and the foreign ministry was to have any say in the conduct of Soviet foreign policy. This is not unique to the Soviet system. This is true of authoritarian systems generally. And what they saw happening was this small band of dissidents, just hundreds of people at most, having a profoundly toxic effect on détente in the aftermath of Helsinki. And this was what inspired the final crackdown on the movement. And again, I don't want to bore you with all of the details, but for all intents and purposes, by 1982, the movement had been crushed. Half of the activists from the high point of 1968 had been forced out of the country, and of the remaining half, the majority were either in prison or in exile. So the story essentially ends there, except that it doesn't. And the coda to this story is the arrival in the Kremlin of Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985, the beginnings of his campaign of so-called perestroika or restructuring, and the very striking vocabulary that people heard from his mouth coming out of the Kremlin itself, which seemed to echo the dissident vocabulary, the dissident lexicon, in some pretty striking ways. Gorbachev talked about glasnost. Gorbachev talked about democratization, demokratizatsiya. And dissidents at the time, including one of the most prominent, a woman named Lyudmila Alexeyeva, remarked in her memoirs that we forgive Gorbachev for taking our ideas, we're just glad that he adopted them, and it's so nice to see them coming out from the pinnacle of the system rather than from street-level demonstrators. Ever since then, there's been lively debates about how much credit or blame, again, depending on your politics, the dissidents deserve for the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'll just close with a couple of observations as an historian of this question. The dissidents never intended to bring down the Soviet state. Like most Soviet citizens, they could not even imagine a day in their lifetime when the Soviet Union would not exist. It seemed to be a forever country to virtually everybody. So that was never their intent. It is striking, though, the amount of not just words, but ideas that seem to have made their way into Gorbachev's reform program. And Gorbachev has made, as you can imagine, many autobiographical statements over the years, some while he was still in power, some after power. The gist of what he has said is that the dissidents had an influence on, as he put it, the spiritual condition of Soviet society that far outpaced the actual number of dissidents, was far out of proportion with the size of the movement. But he was quick to add, in a system like the Soviet one, real reform could only come from inside the party, from the top. To my mind, this is a tragic diagnosis. It's also a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the top of the system is the one part that has never been reformed. So true reform cannot only involve ideas that emanate from the Kremlin. It must involve, if there's going to be any kind of democratic or quasi-democratic future, ideas and participation below the level of political elites. So I don't think the dissidents brought down the Soviet Union. They contributed some ideas that helped produce that effect. And most importantly, by showing over and over again that the Soviet state was unable to honor its own laws, something that you normally expect of a modern political system, it helped drain legitimacy from that system. It helped hollow it out from the inside very gradually over many years across many, many trials of political prisoners. And it's precisely that hollowness, I think, that helps explain the suddenness of the collapse. The system collapsed suddenly because it had already been hollowed out. It had already been drained of much of its legitimacy. And that part of the story, I think, does belong in no small measure to the Soviet dissident movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben, for an excellent talk.
Thank you.
So we'll immediately open the floor to questions. And if you could introduce yourself, state your name, where you're from, and then also please be concise because there are a lot of people here. So, yep. And somebody will bring you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Igor Mikeshin, University of Helsinki. Thank you so much. This was a very breathtaking presentation. I especially admire your focus on the people in the shadows and the women dissidents. And that's exactly why I would like to contest your title, maybe to one letter. I'm thinking about the letter S in the very, very end, movements. And one of the examples, cases I would like to think about, speaking about the shadows and women dissidents, is the religious dissident movement. Exactly the same time, in the 60s, not so many people remember that, like in the year 66, there was a big Baptist demonstration next to the Central Committee, which includes several hundreds of people in the center of Moscow, unthinkable, unprecedented. and a huge network of underground activities by underground unregistered Baptists, including printeries, and the network of support of prisoners, and the all-female council of wives and mothers of prisoners, and so on, so forth. And totally independent of that, there was an underground movement of Pentecostals who campaigned for leaving the USSR, and only 7 people managed to do that, hiding in the US Embassy for 5 years, and so on and so forth. So they were totally unrelated, although the political dissidents recognized their cause and mentioned them continuously, both Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov, for example. But generally, they were totally unrelated to each other, and they acted separately. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing up that topic. I think I could add to that critique. It's not just religious minorities, especially evangelical Christians of various kinds, who protested and in some cases pioneered techniques of protest. It's also the national minority movements, the non-Russian national movements, but also the Russian national movements within the Soviet Union. So what I wanted to really focus on in this book is the language that sooner or later almost all of those movements adopted, and that was the language of civil liberties, of the defense of rights. And I had to limit the scope of the book in some way, and so my focus is really on the people known as the rights defenders, the pravozащитники. And the Pentecostals, the people who sought greater autonomy or even independence for Ukraine or for Lithuania or other non-Russian territories, they were not really interested in reforming the Soviet system. They had a much more focused agenda, and it deserves to be said there were many more of them than there were dissidents. You know, when the Crimean Tatars circulated petitions demanding the right to return from their exile to Crimea, they got tens of thousands, sometimes over 100,000 signatures, something the rights defenders never got close to. So in terms of numbers, your point is very well taken. But I have a specific theme and agenda in this book, which is how do people in an authoritarian system try to mobilize law, the law of that system itself, as a form of leverage. That seems to me the most distinctive and most interesting thing. It's characteristic of dissident movements in virtually all of the Soviet-style systems that we know of, in Eastern Europe and in today's China as well. It's very uncharacteristic of resistance movements in other systems. So in Nazi Germany, none of the resistance groups, whether they were the communists or elite members of the army, none of them tried to use Nazi law. So this is a truly distinctive tactic, and that for me became the organizing principle. But thank you for the comment.
Excuse me, I did receive the microphone. Geir Flikke, Professor, University of Oslo. Thank you for a very exciting presentation of your book. It's definitely a must-read, and I will definitely read it. I have a question, because, you know, history moves in waves, and although I fully accept the argument that dissidents were actually trying to interpret and use Soviet law, the paradox is that one of the more notable dissidents, Andrei Sakharov, was the one that, towards the end of his life, was rallying for changing the constitution, namely abolishing paragraph 6 in the Soviet constitution, the monopoly of power of the CPSU. So I come from a country, Norway, that actually gave him the Peace Prize. And also I followed the tradition of journalists like Per Egil Hegge from Aftenposten, who actually smuggled out some of the manuscripts of Sakharov and got them translated. So again, how do you relate to that specific paradox in your book? Surely they did not want to, as you say, perhaps even were aware of the fact that this could abolish the Soviet Union, but it certainly did. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, you've put your finger on what I think was one of the tactical weaknesses of the so-called legal strategy. It wasn't just that the dissidents, or Sakharov, as you correctly say, themselves eventually came to advocate changing certain aspects of the Constitution. The Soviet government was fully capable of tweaking or inventing new laws in order to make life more difficult for anyone aspiring to freedom of speech or freedom of assembly. So the law was not a fixed language. It itself was malleable, and the Soviet state had more power than any other entity to change that language. But in fact, the problem that you've identified is even deeper. Sakharov was one of the few dissidents who, by the early 1970s, recognized that campaigning on avoiding a return to Stalinism was no longer enough. Because whatever you thought of Leonid Brezhnev in 1965 or 1970 or 1975, he was no Stalin. He did not return and did not want to return the Soviet Union to a system of mass terror. And remember, terror is a form of violence that is random by design. That's how it creates maximal fear, is by leaving everyone potentially vulnerable. You don't have to have committed any kind of crime to be subject to repression under a state-sponsored system of terror. Brezhnev was not interested in that. Not because he was necessarily a wonderful human being, but because some of the most prominent victims of the terror were high-ranking members of the Communist Party. So the step away from mass terror was an act of self-preservation by the political elite. But Sakharov, and by the way, I want to emphasize, since you're clearly a scholar of legal systems, that the overwhelming majority of Soviet dissidents were from what we would now call the STEM fields: science, engineering, mathematics, computer science. There were almost no trained lawyers among them. They were all amateur lawyers. And yet, they kept law at the center of their strategy. So Sakharov recognizes that the fear of a return to Stalinism is no longer a galvanizing principle. And he's one of the first dissidents to ask, what kind of politics do we actually advocate? What kind of political program can we offer people in the Soviet Union? That was a very difficult moment for the dissident movement, because the movement had been able to bring people from many, many different ideological backgrounds, social backgrounds, mostly within the intelligentsia, but still intellectually very diverse. So, you know, at the end of the chain reaction era of the movement, you had dissidents who were Leninists, you had dissidents who were liberals, you had monarchists, you had nationalists, you had believers, you had atheists, pretty much the entire spectrum of Soviet society. And I want to remind you, that was a fantastically diverse society along any metric you might choose: language, ethnicity, religion, political belief. It's one thing to bring people together around the common denominator of, let's make the state observe its own laws. But as soon as you try to go beyond that and formulate a political platform, all of that diversity becomes a problem. And that is what happened in the movement in the early 1970s. So it tried to cling to that human rights model, and they really conceived of human rights as something that was outside politics, a strictly legal, moral position about what states may do and may not do. But sooner or later, they had to confront their own political diversity, including the desire to change certain laws in the Constitution. So you've put your finger on a very sensitive point in the history of the movement.
Yep. Velko?
Which is Oberlin College. Is it on? Do I have to?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Veljko Vujic, Oberlin College. A little bit of an unfair question, but you know, we see today in Russia a much greater escalation of repression, especially since the arrest of Navalny, and we also saw a very successful and fast change to the constitution. And we also know that people like Navalny and others, you know, when they were arrested, you know, used to ask the question, по какой основе, you know, on what grounds are you arresting me? Why, you're violating the laws, you're violating the constitution, and so on, and you're acting in extra-constitutional ways. And yet they are able to do it. And in some ways, the situation seems much worse today than in the Soviet Union. And it's a paradox, in the late Soviet Union. It's a paradox because Russian society was never as free to express itself in some ways as at least in the first 20, 25 years of the post-Soviet period. So why is it that now you know, this system is able to egregiously violate, you know, its own laws without facing opposition, even before 2022, or without facing significant opposition.
Thank you. The situation today is indeed grim. Vladimir Putin learned a lot in his years as a KGB agent. And despite what you may think if you just read his quasi-memoir, Первое лицо, he did not spend his time as a KGB agent only in Dresden, in the foreign service of that, the foreign branch of that organization. He also, for a time, worked in the division, the so-called 5th Division, the Пятое отделение, in Leningrad, and the goal of that division was to suppress dissent of all kinds. So he had personal experience, and I'm sure he observed, watched, and learned a lot in the waning years of the Soviet system. And the Russian government today is much more sophisticated in its handling of dissent, much more sophisticated. It has a much better ear for public relations. So even though many of the trials of dissidents, whether it's of Navalny or Yashin or Karamurza or the members of Pussy Riot, even though those trials don't look great by international juridical standards, they've done much less damage to the regime than the trials of Soviet dissidents. The trials of Soviet dissidents, interestingly, starting with Sinyavsky and Daniel in 1966, almost without exception, they produced the verdict that the government wanted, namely guilty. And they produced the sentences that the government wanted, whether it was 3 years or 5 years or 7 years. That happened, as they say in Russian, "не случайно," because the government told the judge what the verdict was going to be and what the sentences were going to be before the trial started. So they got the legal result that they wanted, but they didn't get the political result that they wanted, because in most cases, those trials were public relations disasters for the state. The defendants pleaded not guilty, which in the Soviet context was very unusual, and they had the chance to defend themselves in court, and in many cases, the transcripts of those trials, as I described, were secretly created and smuggled so that they could be distributed by samizdat within the country and smuggled abroad. So over and over again, the government was getting the legal result that it wanted, but the PR, the public political dividend was disastrous. And we know this because the officials in charge said it over and over again. You know, these bastards, we're making martyrs out of them. This was one of the reasons why the KGB in the final decades of Soviet history became an increasingly lawless organization. It wasn't getting what it wanted out of its own legal system, so it resorted to extrajudicial punishment. Putin has arranged things, and when I say Putin, I mean, of course, a whole team of people. I don't want to pretend that he's the only one, not at all. But the Putin government has arranged things in such a way that the legal system more or less gets them what they want, and if it doesn't, they have other means of repression that they can use, and they no longer are as sensitive to Western criticism as Soviet leaders were. One of the revelations for me of working on this book was reading transcripts of Politburo discussions. What are we going to do about the dissidents? What are we going to do with Solzhenitsyn? What are we going to do with Pyotr Yakir? These people are getting all kinds of attention in the West. Should we arrest them? Should we exile them? Should we kill them? You know, they went through all of the options. And so I'm from Baltimore, which is a kind of a third-tier city in the United States, just about 100 kilometers north of Washington, D.C. And our local newspaper is the Baltimore Sun, which I'm pretty sure none of you have ever heard of or read. There was a meeting of the Politburo in which Leonid Brezhnev was quoting, in a spirit of indignation, the Baltimore Sun, because it had said something critical about the Soviet human rights record. And that's when I realized, oh my God, these guys really cared. They really cared. You know, if the Baltimore Sun could get under Leonid Brezhnev's skin, that tells us something. Putin doesn't care. Putin does not care. And so the mechanism of naming and shaming, you know, the classic public ritual of the human rights movement is not working because, ladies and gentlemen, shame is a culturally specific reaction. And if the culture shifts, shame no longer happens. So we're dealing with a different force field now, and the result of that is to give much more elbow room, much more room for manipulation by the Soviet state. The real problem, though, which I think you're maybe alluding to, or maybe I'm reading into your question, is that Putin has been able to do these kinds of things, not just repress people like Navalny, you know, using lethal poison and other means to attack political opposition, but going all the way back to the early years of his time in office, he is able to do things that violate the fundamental principles of democracy with impunity. He knows he can do this without being punished. And that is because the Russian population does not punish leaders for doing those kinds of things. So when Putin, well, let's go back all the way to before Putin came to power. When Putin's mentor in St. Petersburg, the law professor Anatoly Sobchak, encountered a city council that was difficult to work with, that he didn't like, he abolished it with impunity. When Putin decided that regional governors from the many 90-some provinces of Russia, that they should no longer be elected, they should be appointed by the Kremlin, there were a few ripples of protest, but he was not punished for that. There was no blowback. He didn't lose the next election. People didn't disassociate themselves from him. And the real heart of the problem is the impunity with which the state can violate its own laws now. Unless that gets fixed, the problem will just persist.
Yeah, Marco, and then we'll go here.
Markku Kuikkönen, Aleksanteri Institute. I'd like to point to another figure which you didn't mention, Yeltsin. My first question concerns the role of Yeltsin in general. Wasn't he also, his criticism against the Communist Party was kind of immanent critic. He was all the time referring to the principles of the system as if they were real. But he was never punished, only in the very end. So how do you figure out the role of Yeltsin in this sense? But then my second part concerns the backsliding. When did it really start? My own memories from 15 years back, when I tried to, I negotiated with Yeltsin Foundation about the dissident archives of St. Petersburg, whether they would be willing to publish that. And I met the person who was running the foundation at that time, and he said to me immediately that the dissidents didn't play any role in Russian collapse. It was all within the Communist Party.
I encountered that sentiment many, many times. Sometimes it was a little more biting, as when a Russian colleague of mine said, "Why are you wasting your time on those people?" That was not an uncommon reaction to my research when I told people in Russia what I was working on. It's very difficult to pinpoint a moment when the backsliding started. I'm not sure what the purpose of that exercise would be, because it's such a deep problem, and not only on the part of the government, this, let's say, flexible attitude towards the rule of law. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. During the Soviet era, bending the law, circumventing the law, ignoring the law, was something that very many people in the Soviet Union engaged in. And they engaged in it not because they were bad people or disrespectful. It's because that's the way life was made bearable. That's the way the system was made more humane, was to use, as they say, the back door, not the main entrance, but the back door to a problem. The mutual trading of favors. You know, you get me tickets to the ballet, and I'll make sure that your son or daughter has a better chance of getting into the university. That mutual assistance outside the law, sometimes in the form of mutual favors, sometimes in the sort of patronage networks that permeated Soviet society. This was a way of life. So in a sense, we can highlight instances, very dramatic and consequential instances, of the Soviet state violating or ignoring its own law, but that practice is deeply embedded in the political culture of the Soviet Union, and I think that's a legacy that persists to this day. One of the, if you were to argue against me, or if I were to argue against myself, I would say that one thing that was notable about Navalny and many of the people in his entourage, including those who are still alive today, like Lyuba Sobol and others, is that they are lawyers. They are professional lawyers. They actually have legal training. And they use the law in a way that is much less tolerant of that kind of legal flexibility and bending the law or breaking the law to make life more bearable. They want to create a true system of the rule of law. But that's an uphill struggle, not just because of the state, but because of the decade-old set of habits of the Soviet population themselves. You know, I observed some instances this just among my own friends in Russia where it's almost like bending the law is a national pastime and working the system in a way that helps you and your friends, because after all, what is more valuable in life than your friends and your family? That is a source of pleasure. That's a source of exercising agency. Over the long run, though, it's potentially quite damaging.
Okay, I feel I'm going to make some people unhappy, but we are going to have to end here because we have a closing ceremony, I believe, in 10 or 15 minutes. Please help me thank Ben Nathans for an excellent talk, and thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
And I think we'll all take a lot from this, and we now have a new answer to the question of when is Russia going to change? The answer being when the government reads the Baltimore Sun and cares about the Baltimore Sun. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, again.
Thank you very much.